The rental car's GPS announced her arrival with mechanical certainty. You have reached your destination. Emily Carter sat motionless in the driver's seat, staring through the windshield at streets that seemed frozen in amber. 18 years had passed since she'd driven down Maple Avenue, yet the same cracked sidewalk stretched before her childhood home. The same oak tree cast shadows across the same faded yellow house with its peeling paint and crooked mailbox. Everything looked smaller than she remembered. The grand boulevard of her childhood had shrunk to a modest street lined with aging ranch houses and overgrown hedges. The corner store where she'd bought penny candy had become a Dollar General, its harsh fluorescent sign cutting through the late afternoon light. Even the sky seemed lower here, pressing down with the weight of memories she'd spent years trying to outrun. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emily had flown from JFK to Chicago that morning, then driven the final 2 hours through cornfields and forgotten towns. Each mile marker had felt like stepping backward through time, shedding layers of the woman she'd become until she was 17 again, desperate to escape the suffocating certainty that this place would define her forever. The town of Millfield, population 83,447, had carved itself into her identity like scar tissue. During her senior year presentations about post-graduation plans, while her classmates spoke confidently about community college or joining family businesses, Emily had stood before the class and declared her intention to build a global company. The laughter had started as nervous chuckles and crescendoed into outright mockery. "Dream big, Emily," Mark Dawson had called out from the back row, his voice dripping with the casual cruelty that popular kids wielded like a birthright. "Maybe you can start by dreaming your way out of that thrift store jacket." The memory made her hands tighten on the steering wheel. That thrift store jacket had been her mother's best blazer, carefully altered to fit Emily's smaller frame. Linda Carter had worked double nursing shifts for months to afford the interview outfit that would help her daughter present herself properly to college admissions officers. The jacket had been her armor, and Mark had stripped it away with 7 words. Emily forced herself to breathe deeply, the way her executive coach had taught her during those early days when imposter syndrome threatened to derail board meetings. That scared teenager was gone. The woman who now sat behind the wheel ran Aurora Threads, a sustainable fashion empire worth $1.2 billion. Her company's ethical manufacturing practices had revolutionized supply chains across 3 continents. Vogue had featured her on their cover. The UN had invited her to speak on sustainable development goals. Yet none of that mattered as she stared at her childhood home. The front door opened before she could gather the courage to walk up the cracked cement path. Linda Carter appeared in the doorway, her silver hair catching the porch light, her face creased with the kind of joy that made Emily's chest ache. At 64, her mother moved with the careful precision of someone whose body had absorbed decades of 12-hour hospital shifts, but her smile remained the same brilliant beacon that had guided Emily through every childhood crisis. "There's my girl," Linda called out, her voice carrying across the yard like a prayer answered. Emily stepped out of the car and into her mother's embrace, breathing in the familiar scent of Dove soap and the faint antiseptic smell that never quite left Linda's clothes. For a moment, she allowed herself to be simply a daughter coming home. "I can't believe you're really here," Linda whispered, pulling back to study Emily's face. "You look beautiful, sweetheart, successful, like you've been eating well." The last comment made Emily smile despite the knot in her stomach. Linda Carter expressed love through concerns about nutrition, proper sleep, and whether her children were wearing enough layers for the weather. Some things never changed. They settled into the living room where Emily had spent countless evenings hunched over homework at the coffee table, determined to earn her way out of circumstances that felt increasingly smaller with each passing year. The furniture was the same, the navy blue sofa with its carefully placed throw pillows to hide the worn spots, the entertainment center that had seemed impossibly sophisticated when they'd bought it secondhand, the gallery wall of family photos chronicling graduations, birthdays, and holidays. "Tell me everything," Linda said, settling into her favorite armchair. "How's the business? Are you eating enough vegetables? You look thin." Emily had learned long ago to translate her mother's questions. How's the business meant, are you happy? Are you eating enough vegetables meant, are you taking care of yourself? You look thin meant, I worry about you every single day. The business is good, Mom. Really good. I've been traveling a lot. Meetings in London, a new factory opening in Vietnam, sustainability conferences. It's been... Emily paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound like bragging. Linda had raised her children to be humble, to never put on airs or make others feel small. Even now, with Aurora Threads generating more revenue than most small countries, Emily found herself downplaying her success. It sounds wonderful, Linda said, but her eyes carried a familiar wariness. And you're coming to the reunion tomorrow night. The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Emily had flown halfway around the world for board meetings, had negotiated deals in languages she barely spoke, She was still absorbing this recognition when she became aware of movement behind her, the particular kind of purposeful approach that suggested someone had been waiting for the right moment to engage. She turned to find Mark Dawson approaching with the calculated swagger of someone who'd spent the evening drinking just enough liquid courage to fuel his next performance. Mark Dawson moved through the gymnasium with the practiced confidence of someone who'd spent 18 years convincing himself that high school had been the pinnacle of his existence. He carried a plastic cup of what Emily assumed was beer, and his cheeks had taken on the slightly flushed appearance that suggested this wasn't his first drink of the evening. "Emily," he called out, his voice projecting across the immediate area with the kind of volume that was designed to draw attention. "Just the person I was looking for." Emily felt her conversation with Coach Reynolds settle into her bones like armor, the memory of being seen and believed providing a foundation of strength she hadn't possessed earlier in the evening. She turned to face Mark with the kind of calm composure that came from remembering who she was beneath the surface of old insecurities. "Mark," she said evenly, "enjoying the reunion?" "Oh, absolutely. Nothing like catching up with old friends, sharing war stories, finding out how everyone's doing." His smile carried that particular edge of anticipation that suggested he was preparing to hold court. "Actually, I was just thinking we should do some formal catching up. Give everyone a chance to hear about the amazing adventures we've all been having." Emily recognized the setup immediately. This was the playground equivalent of show and tell, designed to put her on display for the entertainment of classmates who'd remained within the comfortable boundaries of Millfield's expectations. Mark was about to turn her into a cautionary tale, living proof that dreaming big was just an expensive way to learn humility. She glanced around the gymnasium and realized that several conversations had paused, people subtly orienting themselves to overhear whatever was about to unfold. The social dynamics of high school never really died. They just grew more sophisticated in their cruelty. Mark raised his plastic cup and clinked it with a plastic spoon someone had handed him, the sound cutting through the background music with surprising effectiveness. "Ladies and gentlemen, classmates and friends," he announced, his voice carrying the mock formality of a toastmaster. "I'd like to propose a toast to dreams and reality, to the paths we thought we'd take and the places we actually ended up." The gymnasium gradually quieted as people recognized the performance beginning. Emily felt dozens of eyes turning toward her, the weight of collective attention, as familiar and uncomfortable as it had been during high school presentations. But now she had 18 years of boardroom experience, 18 years of facing hostile investors and skeptical retailers and competitors who'd underestimated her based on her age, gender, and background. "Now, some of us," Mark continued, his gaze settling on Emily with theatrical precision, "were practical from the start. We understood that Millfield had everything we needed: good people, honest work, the kind of community values that matter more than fancy titles or big city promises." The comment was designed to sound noble while simultaneously diminishing anyone who'd chosen differently. Emily recognized the false binary that people like Mark used to justify their choices: Staying meant embracing authentic values, while leaving meant abandoning them for shallow ambitions. But others, Mark's voice took on a tone of mock sympathy, had bigger dreams, global dreams, dreams of conquering the world and showing all of us small-town folks how it's really done. His smile widened as he looked directly at Emily. So I think it would be fascinating to hear from our very own Miss New York about how those dreams worked out. The challenge was unmistakable. Emily felt the particular tension that came from being put on the spot, the sensation of being evaluated by people who had strong opinions about what her answers should be. She could deflect again, could offer another vague response about working in fashion, could maintain the careful modesty that had served as her shield throughout the evening. Or she could tell the truth. "Come on, Emily," Mark prodded, his voice carrying false encouragement. "Don't be modest. Tell us about your empire, your global conquest, all those revolutionary ideas you used to share in class." Emily looked around the room, taking in faces she'd known since childhood. She saw curiosity, skepticism, anticipation, and in some cases, genuine interest in her response. These people had formed their opinions about her teenage self based on limited information and social prejudices, but they'd also lived their own stories of compromise and adaptation over the past 18 years. Sarah caught her eye from across the room, her expression carrying both concern and encouragement. Her friend knew exactly what Emily was capable of revealing, and her slight nod seemed to say, "Your choice, but I'm here either way." "Dreams," Emily said, her voice carrying clearly through the gymnasium without shouting. "That's an interesting way to frame it, Mark." She paused, letting the silence build the way Coach Reynolds had taught her during debate competitions. The room was completely quiet now, except for the faint background music and the distant sound of traffic on Main Street.
"I suppose you could say I work in fashion," Emily continued, her voice taking on the measured cadence of someone choosing words carefully. "In New York, I started a small company after college, focused on sustainable manufacturing practices and ethical supply chains." The response was technically accurate, but deliberately understated. She watched as people processed this information, their faces flickering through various interpretations. A small company could mean anything, from a struggling startup to a boutique operation to something more significant that she was downplaying out of modesty. Mark's grin widened, sensing victory. A small company, how charming. And sustainable manufacturing, very trendy these days. I'm sure the market for expensive, ethical clothing is just booming. The sarcasm was thick enough to cut, designed to reduce her life's work to a frivolous pursuit of fashion trends rather than serious business innovation. Emily felt that familiar fire kindle in her chest, but she also felt something else. Pity for Mark's desperate need to diminish others in order to feel significant. "It's done well enough," she said simply. "Well enough," Mark repeated the phrase with relish. "I love that. Well enough. That's the kind of honest assessment we don't hear often enough. Most people would try to oversell their little ventures, make them sound more important than they really are." Emily noticed Jenny Morrison leaning forward in her chair, her expression caught between anticipation and discomfort. Even the former cheerleader seemed to recognize that Mark was pushing too hard, letting his insecurity show through his performance. "The thing about dreams," Mark continued, his voice taking on the pontifical tone of someone delivering wisdom, "is that they're wonderful motivators when you're young. But eventually, reality has to set in. Eventually, you have to accept that not everyone gets to be special, that most of us are better off finding happiness in ordinary lives rather than chasing fantasies that were never realistic in the first place." The philosophy was perfectly Mark, a worldview that justified limitation by calling it wisdom, that transformed settling into a virtue rather than a choice. Emily understood now that his need to belittle her success wasn't just about high school grudges. It was about protecting a worldview that required her failure in order to make sense. Some people call it growing up, Mark added, his gaze locked on Emily's face, learning to be content with what's actually achievable instead of what sounds impressive in high school presentations. The reference to her teenage presentations was a direct hit, designed to connect her current circumstances to the naive ambitions that had made her a target 18 years ago. But instead of feeling diminished, Emily felt clarity crystallizing around her like armor. She thought about Tommy Alvarez, who'd remembered her words about stubborn dreams and used them as fuel for his own journey to Silicon Valley. She thought about Coach Reynolds, who'd seen vision rather than presumption in her teenage presentations. She thought about the thousands of workers in Aurora Threads factories who earned fair wages in safe conditions, about the environmental impact reports that quantified their company's contribution to cleaner manufacturing, about the board meetings where she'd argued for principles that prioritized people over pure profit. "You know what, Mark?" Emily said, her voice remaining calm, but taking on an edge of steel. "You're absolutely right about one thing. Not everyone gets to be special, but not because special is reserved for certain people, because most people choose comfortable over challenging when the moment comes to decide." The comment hung in the air between them like a thrown gauntlet. Emily saw Mark's confident expression flicker slightly, recognizing that she just shifted the terms of engagement. "The funny thing about dreams," Emily continued, "is that they don't die from being impossible. They die from being abandoned. And sometimes what looks like wisdom is just fear disguised as practicality." Mark's face darkened as he processed the implicit criticism. Around them, the gymnasium had fallen completely silent, conversations pausing as people recognized that something significant was unfolding. "That's very philosophical," Mark said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "But philosophy doesn't pay the bills. Reality does. And the reality is that most of the people who left Millfield chasing big dreams ended up crawling back when those dreams didn't pan out." "Is that what you think happened to me?" Emily asked quietly. "That I'm crawling back?" The question was simple, but it cut to the heart of Mark's assumptions. Emily realized that he'd been operating under the theory that her presence at the reunion was evidence of failure, that successful people didn't return to scenes of their former struggles. Before Mark could respond, Sarah appeared at Emily's side, her teacher's instincts clearly alarmed by the direction of the confrontation. "Maybe we should," Sarah began, but Emily gently touched her friend's arm. "It's okay," Emily said softly. "Mark asked a fair question, and he deserves an honest answer." She looked around the gymnasium one more time, taking in the faces of people she'd known since childhood, people who had formed their opinions about her potential based on incomplete information and social prejudices. Some of them had probably always wondered what had become of the girl who'd talked too big and dreamed too loud. Others had probably assumed her dreams had crashed against the realities of adult life, the way dreams often did. They all deserved to know the truth. "The reality is," Emily said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent gymnasium, "sometimes the dreams don't die. Sometimes they just take longer to arrive than expected." Mark's confident smirk began to fade as he registered something in her tone, something that suggested the conversation was about to take a turn he hadn't anticipated. "Sometimes," Emily continued, "what looks like fantasy to some people is just a business plan that requires more courage than most people are comfortable with." The fire in her chest was building now, fueled by 18 years of being underestimated, of having her vision questioned by people who couldn't see past their own limitations. The moment was coming when she would have to choose between continued modesty and complete honesty. Sarah squeezed her arm gently, a gesture that somehow conveyed both caution and encouragement. Her friend knew exactly what Emily was capable of revealing, knew the ammunition she carried for this particular battle.
Emily looked at Mark Dawson, still handsome at 36, still carrying himself with the swagger of someone who'd peaked at 18, still needing others to fail in order to feel successful himself, and made her choice. The truth was coming. Finally, inevitably, the truth was coming. Sarah's hand found Emily's elbow, gently but firmly, guiding her away from Mark's expectant smirk and the circle of faces waiting for her response. "Let's get some air," Sarah murmured, steering them toward the gymnasium side exit. They slipped into the empty hallway where trophy cases lined the walls, their brass nameplates catching the fluorescent light. Emily could hear her heartbeat in the sudden quiet, could feel the weight of 18 years pressing against her chest like accumulated pressure. "Why are you doing this to yourself?" Sarah's voice carried the frustrated affection of someone who'd watched a friend suffer unnecessarily. "You don't owe Mark Dawson anything. You don't owe any of them anything." Emily stared at a trophy from 2003, a debate championship she'd helped win alongside teammates whose names she could barely remember now. "My mother always said to stay humble, to never make others feel small. Your mother raised you to be kind, not invisible. There's a difference between humility and hiding. You've spent this entire evening letting Mark paint you as a failure when you could end his little performance with 2 sentences." The words hit harder because they came from Sarah, loyal, supportive Sarah who'd chosen her own path without apology, who'd stayed in Millfield not from fear, but from purpose. If Sarah thought Emily was diminishing herself unnecessarily, maybe she was right. "He needs me to have failed. His entire worldview depends on dreams being impossible." Then maybe it's time to shatter his worldview. Maybe it's time to show everyone in that room that some dreams don't die, they just take longer to arrive. Emily met her friend's eyes and saw something there that decided everything. Not jealousy or resentment, but fierce pride. Pride in their friendship, pride in Emily's journey, pride in the possibility that small-town dreamers could write their own endings. "You're right," Emily said, feeling something unlock in her chest. "I'm done shrinking." They returned to find Mark exactly where they'd left him, holding court with renewed confidence. He'd interpreted Emily's exit as retreat, her silence as admission of defeat. His voice carried across the gymnasium as he shared some story about people who confuse education with intelligence, dreams with plans. Emily was preparing her response when the gymnasium's main doors burst open. Principal Martinez, who'd been greeting latecomers in the lobby, appeared with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Folks," he announced, his voice cutting through conversations, "I've just received word that there's been an unusual arrival at our airstrip. Apparently, a private jet has landed and is waiting for—" He consulted his phone. "Emily Carter." The gymnasium fell silent, except for the rustle of people turning in their seats. Emily felt every eye in the room find her face, saw confusion flicker across features as people tried to process this information. Mark's confident expression wavered. That must be a mistake." "That's what I thought too," Principal Martinez continued, clearly enjoying his role as messenger, "but the pilot specifically asked for directions to the reunion. Says he's here to collect Miss Carter for a flight to Paris." Jenny Morrison laughed nervously. "Whose jet is it?" Emily stood slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her like a mantle. She looked directly at Mark Dawson, whose face had gone pale beneath his reunion confidence. "Mine," she said simply. The word dropped into the silence like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through the crowd. She heard someone gasp, saw Sarah beam with undisguised pride, watched as Mark's carefully constructed narrative crumbled in real time. "I'm sorry?" Mark's voice came out as a croak. "The jet," Emily repeated calmly. "It's mine." The gymnasium erupted into whispered conversations and poorly concealed stares. Emily stood in the center of it all, feeling strangely calm as 18 years of assumptions shattered around her like glass. Mark's mouth opened and closed without sound, his social authority evaporating as people began to reassess everything they thought they knew about Emily Carter's trajectory. But instead of savoring his discomfort, Emily felt only a deep, bone-tired relief. The secret she'd carried all evening was finally free,
And with it came the realization that she no longer needed anyone's approval or understanding. "I should probably explain," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the buzz of conversation. "Aurora Threads, my small company, designs and manufactures sustainable fashion for global markets. We're headquartered in New York, with facilities in 12 countries. Tomorrow's board meeting in Paris is about expanding our operations into West Africa." The information was delivered matter-of-factly, without boasting or performance. These were simply facts that deserved acknowledgement. She looked around the room at faces she'd known since childhood, seeing wonder, embarrassment, and in some cases, genuine happiness for her success. "I want to thank all of you," Emily continued, "because growing up here taught me something invaluable. The difference between dreaming and planning isn't the size of the vision. It's the stubbornness to keep working when vision meets reality." Her gaze found Tommy Alvarez near the back, who was grinning with unrestrained joy. It found Coach Reynolds, whose proud smile told her everything she needed to know. It found her mother, who'd appeared during the commotion and was fighting back tears. "Mark," Emily said gently, turning to face him directly, "you were right about one thing. Dreams without work are just wishes. But work without dreams is just time served." She gathered her purse and moved toward the exit, where Sarah fell into step beside her. At the gymnasium doors, Emily turned back one final time. "It was good to see you all again. Thank you for the reminder of how far stubborn dreamers can travel." The doors closed behind them, and Emily Carter stepped into the night air, no longer the girl they'd underestimated, finally and completely the woman she'd chosen to become. Dawn broke over Millfield with the gentle persistence of Midwest mornings, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that made even the most ordinary landscapes seem touched by possibility. Emily stood on the tarmac of the small municipal airstrip, her breath visible in the crisp October air, watching as her flight crew performed their pre-departure checks. The Gulfstream G650 looked almost impossibly sleek against the backdrop of cornfields and grain silos, a piece of the global business world that had somehow landed in the heart of rural Illinois. Emily had grown accustomed to the incongruity over the years, the way her two worlds occasionally collided in moments like this, revealing the distance she'd traveled from the girl who'd once waited for her mother's pickup truck in this very parking lot after debate tournaments. "I still can't quite believe it," Linda Carter said quietly, standing beside her daughter with a coffee mug clutched in both hands. She'd insisted on driving Emily to the airstrip at dawn, claiming she wanted to see her off properly, but Emily suspected her mother simply needed a few more minutes to process the revelations of the previous evening. "The jet?" Emily asked with a small smile. "All of it." Linda's voice carried the wonder of someone whose understanding of her child had been fundamentally revised overnight. "My little girl, who used to practice her presentations in the bathroom mirror, commanding boardrooms in Paris, flies around the world in her own plane, making decisions that affect thousands of people." I heard the pride in her mother's voice, but also something else, a note of apology that made my chest tighten. "Mom, you know I never doubted your support, right? Even when you worried about me getting hurt?" Linda turned to face her daughter, and Emily saw tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. "I spent so many years trying to protect you from disappointment that I forgot to celebrate your courage. When other parents were warning their children not to dream too big, I should have been telling you to dream bigger. You gave me something more important than permission. You gave me resilience. Every time someone told me I couldn't do something, I heard your voice saying, 'Prove them wrong, but do it with class.'" They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as Sarah's car pulled into the airstrip parking lot. Emily's friend had insisted on saying goodbye, claiming she needed to see the jet for herself to believe this was all an elaborate dream.
Sarah approached with characteristic directness, her teacher's practicality evident even at 6 in the morning. "So this is how the other half lives," she said, examining the aircraft with undisguised fascination. "It's beautiful and slightly ridiculous, but mostly beautiful." Tommy Alvarez emerged from the passenger side of Sarah's car, and Emily felt her heart lift at the sight of him. "I hope you don't mind," he said, "but Sarah texted me last night. I couldn't let you leave without saying goodbye properly." "I'm glad you're here," Emily said, meaning it completely. The circle felt right. The people who'd known her before success, who'd believed in her potential when it was nothing more than stubborn determination and untested vision. I have something for you, Tommy said, pulling a small wrapped package from his jacket pocket. Emily opened it to find a simple bookmark, the kind sold in airport gift shops, with a single line printed across it. Some dreams don't die, they just take longer to arrive. Emily laughed, recognizing her own words from the previous evening transformed into a permanent reminder. You're keeping track of my quotes now? Someone has to, Tommy replied with a grin. That one's going to stick with a lot of people. The pilot approached with the professional courtesy of someone accustomed to working with high-level executives. Miss Carter, we're ready for departure whenever you are. Emily hugged her mother first, long and tight, breathing in the familiar scent of home and unconditional love. I'm proud of you, sweetheart, not for the money or the success, but for becoming exactly who you were meant to be. She embraced Sarah next, her childhood friend whose loyalty had never wavered through 18 years of different choices and distant geographies. Thank you for reminding me that some things matter more than winning, Emily said. Thank you for reminding me that some things are worth fighting for, Sarah replied. Tommy's hug was brief, but warm, carrying the solidarity of fellow dreamers who'd refused to accept limitations as final answers. Stay stubborn, he said with characteristic quiet wisdom. Emily climbed the steps to her aircraft and settled into the leather seat by the window. As the jet taxied toward takeoff, she watched Millfield recede below her, the high school where she'd been mocked, the streets where she'd walked with impossible dreams, the town that had tried to define her future by its own boundaries. But as the plane climbed higher and the landscape spread out beneath her like a map of possibilities, Emily realized that Millfield hadn't held her back. It had given her something invaluable, the hunger that came from being underestimated, the fuel that powered the long journey from dreamer to achiever. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Now I know why you were so quiet last night. Some secrets are too big for high school gymnasiums. Emily smiled as she typed back. Some dreams are too big for any room. That's why they need the whole world to grow. The jet turned east toward Paris, toward boardrooms and decisions and the 1,000 details that comprised her global empire. But Emily carried with her something new. The knowledge that success wasn't about leaving your past behind, but about honoring the courage it had taken to begin the journey. The girl who dreamed too big in a town too small had grown into a woman who understood that the size of your dreams mattered less than the strength of your commitment to seeing them through. Far below, Millfield continued its quiet existence, unaware that one of its daughters was crossing the Atlantic at 40,000 feet, carrying with her the stubborn faith that once seemed so impossibly naive and now felt like the only wisdom that truly mattered. Some dreams don't die. They just take longer to arrive. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.
Before audiences of thousands without breaking a sweat. But the thought of walking into Millfield High's gymnasium made her feel 17 again. I promised Sarah I would, Emily said, referencing her childhood best friend, who still taught 3rd grade at the elementary school they'd both attended. Though I'm not sure why. What's the point of rehashing high school? Linda studied her daughter's face with the intensity of someone who'd spent 40 years reading between the lines of Emily's carefully composed expressions. There's been talk around town, about you coming back. What kind of talk? Oh, the usual small-town nonsense, people wondering what you've been up to, whether you ever... Linda trailed off, but Emily could fill in the blanks. Whether you ever amounted to anything, whether those big dreams ever panned out, whether you learned your place. Mark Dawson's been particularly vocal, Linda continued, her voice taking on the edge it always carried when discussing people who'd hurt her children. He's been telling anyone who'll listen that you're probably coming back because things didn't work out in the big city, that dreamers like you always come crawling home eventually.
The words hit Emily like a physical blow. Mark Dawson. Even his name could transport her back to senior year English class where he'd sit behind her and make stage-whispered comments about her fancy words whenever she participated in discussions. He'd peaked at 18. Quarterback, homecoming king, the golden boy who could do no wrong, and apparently assumed everyone else's trajectory followed the same downward arc. He works at his father-in-law's auto dealership now, Linda added quietly. Been there since he graduated, never left town, never married anyone who didn't grow up within 10 miles of here. I think your success threatens him, sweetheart. Always has. Emily felt something shift inside her chest. A familiar fire she'd learned to bank over the years. She'd built Aurora Threads on that fire, had channeled every slight and dismissal into the fuel that powered 17-hour workdays and brutal negotiations with manufacturers who thought a young woman could be easily intimidated. Maybe it's time I reminded Mark Dawson exactly who he's talking about, Emily said quietly. Linda reached across the space between their chairs and took her daughter's hand. Just remember, honey, you don't owe anyone in this town anything. Not explanations, not apologies, not proof. You've already won by becoming who you were meant to be. But as Emily squeezed her mother's hand, she knew Linda was wrong. She did owe them something. She owed them the truth. The Millfield High School gymnasium hadn't changed in 18 years. The same bleachers lined the walls, their wooden planks scarred by decades of sneakers and school spirit. The same motivational banners hung from the rafters. Home of the Fighting Eagles. Excellence through effort. Tradition never graduates. Even the smell was identical, that distinctive combination of floor wax, adolescent anxiety, and broken dreams that seemed permanently embedded in the walls of every American high school. Someone had made an effort with decorations, streamers in the school colors, blue and gold, draped across the ceiling, and round tables covered in plastic tablecloths dotted the floor where the basketball court once showcased Friday night heroes. A registration table sat near the entrance, manned by volunteers who'd never left town, their name tags cheerfully declaring them members of the reunion planning committee. Emily paused in the doorway, her hand gripping the strap of her simple black purse. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, a classic navy dress that could have come from any department store, low heels that wouldn't draw attention, minimal jewelry. Nothing that would scream money or success. She'd learned to camouflage her achievements when necessary, a survival skill developed over years of being the only woman in boardrooms full of men who assumed her presence was either a mistake or a diversity hire. The volunteer at the registration table looked up with the practiced smile of someone who'd been greeting former classmates all evening. Her name tag read, Brenda Walsh, committee chair, and Emily recognized her immediately as the girl who had sat 2 seats behind her in homeroom, the one who had whispered behind her hand whenever Emily raised her hand to answer questions. Oh my goodness, Emily Carter! Brenda's voice carried that distinctive pitch of manufactured enthusiasm. I almost didn't recognize you. You look so... She paused, searching for the right word. Professional. The word hung between them, like a question mark. Emily accepted her name tag, Emily Carter, class of 2005, and pinned it to her dress. Thank you, Brenda. You look wonderful, too. The gymnasium buzzed with the conversations of people trying to bridge the gap between who they had been and who they had become. Emily recognized faces that had softened and hardened in equal measure, hairlines that had receded, bodies that had expanded or contracted under the weight of adult responsibilities. Emily Carter! The voice belonged to Sarah Whitman, and Emily felt her shoulders relax for the first time since entering the building. Sarah pushed through the crowd with the determined efficiency of someone who spent her days corralling third graders, now streaked with premature gray, her face carrying the laugh lines that came from finding joy in small moments. They embraced with the fierce intensity of people who'd survived adolescence together. Sarah had been Emily's anchor during high school, the friend who'd never questioned her dreams or mocked her ambitions. While other classmates had rolled their eyes at Emily's talk of traveling the world and building something meaningful, Sarah had listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and offering encouragement when self-doubt crept in during late-night phone calls. "I can't believe you're actually here," Sarah said, pulling back to study Emily's face. "When you called to say you were coming, I thought you might change your mind at the last minute. You know how much you used to hate these kinds of things." Emily had indeed considered backing out. Her assistant had booked the trip to coordinate with a board meeting in Chicago, making it easy to add a weekend detour. But as the date approached, she'd found herself curious about the people she'd left behind. Not nostalgic, exactly, but curious about how their stories had unfolded. "I figured it was time," Emily said simply. "How are you? How's teaching?" Sarah's face lit up the way it always had when discussing her calling. "I love it! These kids are incredible, so smart, so curious about everything. Last week, I had a little girl ask me if there were colors we can't see, and we ended up spending the whole afternoon researching the light spectrum." She paused, her expression becoming more complex. "I know it's not glamorous, not world-changing like what you probably do, but—" "Sarah," Emily interrupted gently, "teaching third graders is absolutely world-changing. Don't ever apologize for that." The comment seemed to catch her friend off guard, and Emily realized her friend had been preparing a defensive speech about her choices. How many times had Sarah been asked why she'd never left Millfield, never pursued something more ambitious? How many times had she felt compelled to justify finding purpose in work that didn't come with prestigious titles or impressive salaries? Before Sarah could respond, a booming voice cut through the gymnasium chatter like a knife through silk. "Well, well, well, look what the cat dragged back to Millfield." Mark Dawson hadn't changed much in 18 years, at least not in the ways that mattered. He was still tall and broad-shouldered, his hair still thick, though now receding slightly at the temples. His smile still carried that edge of cruelty, disguised as humor, that had made him the unofficial ruler of their high school social hierarchy. He wore khakis and a polo shirt that strained slightly across a midsection softened by years of beer and comfortable assumptions about his place in the world. A small crowd had gathered around him, the same satellite group that had orbited his high school presence. Jenny Morrison, the former head cheerleader who now ran a beauty salon downtown. Brad Phillips, who'd been Mark's lieutenant in the casual bullying that passed for humor in their teenage years. Faces that had once seemed impossibly important, now carrying the slight desperation of people clinging to relevance borrowed from their adolescent selves. "Emily Carter," Mark said, his voice projecting across the immediate area and drawing attention from nearby conversations. "The girl with the biggest dreams in the smallest town. How have you been, sweetheart? Still planning to conquer the world?" The endearment dripped with condescension. Emily felt Sarah tense beside her, her friend's protective instincts still as sharp as they were in high school. But Emily had spent years in boardrooms with men who made Mark Dawson look like an amateur at intimidation. She'd learned to navigate egos, to deflect aggression with grace, to never let them see her sweat. "Hello, Mark," she said evenly. "It's good to see you too." Her refusal to take the bait seemed to momentarily confuse him. He had been expecting defensiveness, perhaps some stammered explanation of her current circumstances. Instead, he got polite indifference. "So, what are you up to these days?" Jenny Morrison chimed in, her voice carrying the same false sweetness Emily remembered from cheerleader tryouts she'd never bothered attending. "Still chasing those big city dreams?" The question was designed to be a trap. Answer too modestly and they'd assume failure. Answer honestly and risk being labeled a braggart. Emily had encountered this dynamic countless times in her professional life, the no-win scenario designed to put successful women in their place. "I work in fashion," Emily said simply, "in New York." The response was truthful but deliberately vague. She watched as the group processed this information, their faces flickering through various interpretations. Fashion could mean anything, from personal shopper to boutique owner to struggling designer waiting tables between auditions. "Fashion, huh?" Mark's grin widened. "Like designing clothes or more like retail?" The way he said retail made it sound like a disease. Emily felt that familiar fire kindle in her chest, the one that had powered her through every obstacle and setback over the past 18 years. But she also felt something else: pity. Looking at Mark now, she could see the desperation beneath his swagger, the way his confidence had curdled into something brittle and
defensive. He needed her to have failed because her success made his own choices feel like settling. "A little of both," she said with a slight smile. Sarah shot her a look that clearly said, "Are you kidding me?" Her friend knew exactly how successful Emily had become. They'd kept in touch sporadically over the years, and Sarah had been following Aurora Thread's meteoric rise through industry publications and business news. But Emily wasn't ready to reveal that hand yet. Let them assume what they wanted. The truth would come out in its own time. "Well, that's nice," Mark said, his tone suggesting it was anything but. "New York's a tough town. Hope you're managing to keep your head above water." The comment stung because it was designed to. Keep your head above water. As if survival was the best she could hope for. As if the dreams he'd mocked 18 years ago had proven as impossible as he'd predicted. Emily felt Sarah's hand brush against her arm, a subtle gesture of support that reminded her she wasn't alone in this. But she also felt something else stirring, a recognition that this moment mattered more than just personal vindication. Every young person in this room who'd ever been told their dreams were too big, every kid who'd been laughed at for wanting more than what their circumstances suggested was possible, deserved to see that small-town skepticism didn't have to be prophetic. The truth was coming, but not yet. First, she wanted to see exactly how far Mark Dawson's assumptions would carry him. The slide projector clicked to life with the mechanical precision of outdated technology, casting a square of harsh white light across the darkened gymnasium wall. Someone had dimmed the overhead lights, and conversations dropped to whispers as the reunion committee prepared their nostalgic journey back to 2005. Emily found herself at a table near the back with Sarah and a few other classmates she vaguely remembered, quiet kids who'd flown under the radar, survivors rather than stars. They'd chosen seats that offered clear views of both the slideshow and the exits, a positioning that felt strategic rather than coincidental. These were people who understood the importance of escape routes. The first image appeared, the school building, its brick facade looking exactly as it did tonight. A collective "aww" rose from the audience, the sound of people trying to convince themselves that high school had been the best years of their lives, rather than something to be endured and escaped. More images followed in predictable succession. Homecoming courts, football victories, prom kings and queens. Each slide triggered a fresh wave of commentary from the crowd, voices calling out names and memories with the forced enthusiasm of people performing happiness for an audience of their former selves. Mark Dawson had positioned himself at a table near the front, naturally assuming his place as the evening's unofficial master of ceremonies. His voice carried easily through the gymnasium as he provided running commentary on each image, reminding everyone of his central role in their shared mythology. "Oh man, remember that game against Central?" he called out as a photo of the football team appeared. "I threw for 3 touchdowns that night. Coach said it was the best performance he'd seen in 20 years. Emily watched him bask in the reflected glory of teenage achievements,
And she realized that Mark had never updated his resume. At 36, he was still leading with accomplishments from when he was 17, still mining glory from a very shallow well. The slideshow continued. Band concerts, drama club productions, academic awards ceremonies. Emily's stomach tightened as she recognized the pattern. Soon they'd reach the senior awards banquet, and her younger self would appear on screen for everyone to dissect. She was right. The image that appeared showed the school auditorium filled with graduates and their families. Emily recognized the night immediately, the night where they had handed out superlatives voted by the senior class. Most likely to succeed, most athletic, class clown. And there, projected larger than life, was 18-year-old Emily Carter accepting an award she'd forgotten about until this moment. Most likely to dream big, the slide caption read in cheerful yellow letters. The gymnasium erupted in laughter. Not the fond, nostalgic kind, but the sharp edge of people remembering a shared joke at someone else's expense. Emily felt heat rise in her cheeks as dozens of eyes turned toward her table, seeking confirmation that the dreamer was indeed present for her moment of reckoning. "Oh my God, Emily, I'd forgotten about that! Most likely to dream big! That was you, wasn't it?" Mark Dawson stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the gymnasium floor with dramatic purpose. Emily recognized the performance. He was about to hold court, and everyone in the room was expected to be his audience.
"Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying the mock formality of a game show host, "I give you Miss New York herself, Emily Carter, winner of the Most Likely to Dream Big Award, class of 2005. The applause that followed was polite, but loaded with subtext. Emily felt every eye in the room evaluating her outfit, her posture, her circumstances. She'd become a case study in real time, evidence for whatever theory each person held about dreams versus reality. "So, Emily," Mark continued, turning to face her directly, "tell us all about those dreams. How'd they work out for you?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Emily could feel Sarah tensing beside her, could sense her friend preparing to leap to her defense. But this was Emily's moment to navigate, her choice about how to respond to the test she'd been unconsciously preparing for since the day she left Millfield. She stood up slowly, her movement as deliberate as Mark's had been. The gymnasium fell silent except for the hum of the slide projector and the distant sound of traffic on Main Street. Emily looked around the room, taking in faces she'd known since childhood, seeing some with curiosity, others with skepticism, most with the particular kind of interest reserved for watching someone either rise to an occasion or be destroyed by it. "Dreams," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the space. "That's an interesting word choice, Mark." She paused, letting the silence build. Years of board presentations had taught her the power of strategic pauses, the way they could shift energy and focus attention. "I suppose you could say my dreams have evolved," she continued. "These days, I mostly dream about sustainable supply chains and ethical manufacturing practices. Not quite as romantic as teenage dreams, but they pay the bills." The response was perfectly crafted, modest enough to avoid seeming boastful, specific enough to suggest expertise, vague enough to leave room for interpretation. She watched as people processed her words, trying to decode what they meant. Mark's smile faltered slightly. He'd been expecting either defensive justification or obvious failure, neither of which he was getting. Supply chains, sounds practical. Very different from the girl who used to talk about changing the world. "Oh, I still believe in changing the world," Emily replied calmly. "I've just learned that change happens through work, not wishes." The comment hit its target. Mark's face darkened as he processed the implied criticism that his own world changing had stopped at wishes, that he'd chosen the path of comfort over challenge.
That's great, Emily. Really inspiring. But let's be honest here. How many people in this room actually ended up where they thought they'd be at 18? Sometimes growing up means accepting that the world doesn't owe you anything just because you dreamed big. The attack was more direct now, the subtext becoming text. Mark was essentially arguing that Emily's teenage ambitions had been naive, that maturity meant accepting limitations rather than challenging them. It was the philosophy of someone who'd convinced himself that settling was wisdom rather than surrender. Emily felt that familiar fire spreading through her chest, the one that had powered her through every obstacle and setback of the past 18 years. But she also felt something else: clarity. Looking at Mark now, she could see exactly what he was. A man so threatened by the possibility of her success that he needed her to have failed in order to feel good about his own choices. "You're absolutely right," she said quietly. "The world doesn't owe anyone anything, which is why we have to create our own opportunities." Before Mark could respond, the slide projector clicked to the next image, another group shot, this one from graduation day. Emily saw herself in the back row, her expression serious and determined, a scholarship winner heading to college while most of her classmates planned gap years or local jobs. Looking at that 18-year-old girl projected on the gymnasium wall, Emily felt a surge of protective affection. That girl had been brave in ways she couldn't have understood at the time, choosing uncertainty over safety, possibility over comfort. She deserved better than mockery. She deserved belief. Sarah leaned close and whispered, "You don't have to take this, you know. Half the people in this room would kill to have accomplished half of what you have." Emily looked at her friend, sweet, loyal Sarah, who'd stayed in Millfield and found purpose in teaching children to read, who'd chosen her own path with just as much courage as Emily had chosen hers. Sarah's definition of success wasn't measured in dollars or magazine covers, but in the light that appeared in an 8-year-old's eyes when they finally understood a math concept they'd been struggling with for weeks. But Sarah was wrong about one thing. Emily didn't have to take Mark's condescension, but she wanted to, because somewhere in this room might be another 18-year-old spirit crushed by the weight of other people's limitations, another dreamer who'd been told their ambitions were impossible. The slideshow continued, but Emily was no longer watching. She was calculating, planning, waiting for the right moment to show Mark Dawson and everyone else in this gymnasium exactly what most likely to dream big looked like when those dreams were backed by 2 decades of relentless work. The moment was coming. Soon, very soon, Millfield would learn that some dreams don't die. They just take longer to arrive than expected. The gymnasium felt suffocating after Mark's performance, the air thick with judgment and the particular brand of small-town schadenfreude that fed on perceived failure. Emily needed space, to breathe, to collect herself away from the eyes that seemed to catalog every micro-expression for signs of defeat or defensiveness. She slipped through the crowd toward the exit, murmuring polite excuses as she navigated between tables of people reliving their glory days. The evening air hit her like a benediction when she pushed through the heavy metal doors that led to the parking lot. October in the Midwest carried that distinctive chill that warned of winter's approach, and Emily pulled her light cardigan tighter around her shoulders. The parking lot stretched before her, filled with pickup trucks and aging sedans under the pale glow of sodium streetlights. She could hear the muffled sounds of the reunion continuing inside. Laughter, conversation, the occasional burst of music from someone's phone playlist. It felt surreal to be standing in the exact spot where she'd waited for her mother to pick her up after debate practice, after student government meetings, after all those extracurricular activities she'd packed into her schedule like armor against mediocrity. Emily? Emily Carter? She turned toward the voice, squinting in the dim light to make out a figure approaching from the far end of the parking lot. The man was average height, slightly built, with dark hair that had begun to thin at the crown.
He wore jeans and a button-down shirt that suggested he'd put thought into his reunion outfit without trying too hard to impress anyone. It took her a moment to place him, and then recognition clicked into focus. Tommy Alvarez. The quiet kid who'd sat in the back of most of their shared classes, who'd been nearly invisible in the social ecosystem of Millfield High. He remembered him as perpetually hunched over a book, always the first to finish tests, always the last to be picked for teams in gym class. Shh. Tommy, she said, genuine warmth creeping into her voice. I wasn't sure you'd be here. He smiled, and she was struck by how much he'd changed. The nervous energy that had defined his teenage years had settled into something calmer, more confident. His clothes fit well, his posture was straight, and his eyes held the kind of peace that came from finding your place in the world. I almost didn't come, he admitted, stopping a few feet from her. But curiosity got the better of me. Plus, I heard through the grapevine that you were going to be here, and I wanted to see for myself how you'd turned out. The comment surprised her. During high school, she and Tommy had existed in the same social stratum. The overlooked, the academic, the ones who didn't quite fit the prescribed categories that govern teenage hierarchies. But they'd rarely spoken directly, their interaction limited to the occasional nod of recognition in the hallways or shared eye roll during particularly tedious assemblies. How are you been? Emily asked, settling against the side of her rental car. What are you up to these days? Tommy's smile widened, and she caught a glimpse of the enthusiasm that probably had been buried under layers of adolescent self-consciousness. I'm a software engineer, actually, based in San Francisco now. I work for a company that develops cybersecurity solutions for financial institutions. The pride in his voice was unmistakable, but it wasn't the boastful kind that had characterized Mark's earlier proclamations. This was the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd found work that challenged and fulfilled him. That's incredible, Emily said, meaning it. San Francisco must be quite a change for Millfield. You could say that, Tommy laughed, a sound that carried hints of the nervous kid she remembered, but also something richer, more grounded. Some days I still can't believe I live there. The first time I saw the Golden Gate Bridge from my apartment window, I actually teared up. I understood that feeling perfectly. The disorientation that came with realizing you'd traveled farther than anyone had expected, including yourself. When did you leave? Right after graduation, same as you. Got a full scholarship to Northwestern for computer science. Spent the first semester convinced they made a mistake and would ask me to leave. He paused, studying her face in the streetlight. I kept thinking about something you said during senior year. In Mrs. Peterson's English class, when we were discussing that Langston Hughes poem about deferred dreams. Emily frowned, trying to access a memory from nearly 20 years ago. I don't remember what I said. You said that dreams don't die from being deferred, they die from being abandoned. That the difference between dreamers who make it and dreamers who don't isn't talent or luck, it's stubbornness. Tommy's voice took on a more serious tone. I thought about that a lot during those first few months in college, when everything felt impossible and I wanted to come home. The memory surfaced gradually, like a photograph developing in solution. She could see Mrs. Peterson's classroom, smell the combination of chalk dust and industrial carpet cleaner, and remembered the way Mark had rolled his eyes when she'd offered her interpretation of Hughes's poem.
Words. She'd been 17, earnest in the way that only teenagers could be, convinced that the right combination of determination and hard work could overcome any obstacle. I can't believe you remembered that, Emily said softly. Are you kidding? You were like proof that it was possible. You were the only person in our class who talked about leaving like it was inevitable instead of impossible. Tommy's expression grew more animated. Do you know how many nights I lay awake in my dorm room, homesick and terrified, thinking about Emily Carter, who was probably somewhere conquering New York? You were my evidence that kids like us could make it out. The words hit Emily with unexpected force. During those brutal early years in New York,
sleeping on couches, working 3 jobs while trying to build Aurora threads from nothing, facing rejection after rejection from investors who couldn't see past her age and gender. She'd felt completely alone. The idea that her teenage self had somehow inspired someone else, had served as a beacon of possibility for another dreamer, was almost overwhelming. "I had no idea," she managed. "I always felt like I was struggling alone out there." "That's the thing about being brave," Tommy said gently. "You don't always know who's watching, who needs to see that courage is possible. I spent my entire senior year working up the nerve to apply to colleges outside Illinois, and half the reason I finally did it was because I kept thinking, if Emily Carter can dream of building a global company, I can at least dream of Silicon Valley." Emily felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She'd spent so much energy over the years processing the criticism, the mockery, the constant chorus of voices telling her she was reaching too high. She'd never considered that somewhere in all that noise, someone had been listening to the dream itself rather than the doubts surrounding it. "What you said about stubbornness," Tommy continued, "I think you were right. Success isn't about being the smartest or the most talented. It's about being too stubborn to quit when quitting makes sense." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two survivors of Millfield High School's particular brand of suffocating certainty. Emily found herself studying Tommy's face, seeing echoes of the quiet kid who'd endured his share of casual cruelty from classmates who mistook introversion for weakness. "Did you—" she started, then stopped, unsure how to frame the question delicately. "Did I get picked on?" Tommy supplied with a rueful smile. "Oh, yeah. Not as obviously as some kids, but the subtle stuff. The eye rolls when I got excited about computers, the way certain people would make it clear that my interests weren't worth their time. Mark Dawson once told me I'd end up fixing other people's computers for the rest of my life, like that was some kind of insult." Emily's jaw tightened. Even 18 years later, Mark's casual cruelty had the power to ignite that familiar fire in her chest. "The funny thing is," Tommy continued, "he wasn't entirely wrong. I do work with computers every day. The difference is, I love it. I get to solve puzzles that matter, build systems that protect people's financial security, work with some of the brightest minds in tech." Mark probably thought he was predicting my failure, but he accidentally described my dream job. The observation was so perfectly Tommy, thoughtful, even generous towards those who'd been unkind to him, finding wisdom in experiences that could have bred bitterness. Emily found herself smiling for the first time since entering the reunion. "I needed to hear that," she admitted. "Tonight's been challenging." "Mark giving you grief?" Tommy's expression darkened slightly. "I saw some of the performance in there before I stepped out for air. Same old Mark, I guess." "Some things never change," Emily sighed. "He's still convinced that dreaming big is the same as living in fantasy. Maybe for him it is, but that's his limitation, not yours. The rest of us know better." He paused, then added with characteristic thoughtfulness, "You know what I realized watching him in there? He's still performing for the same audience he had in high school. But the thing about audiences, if you never leave the theater, you never find out what else is playing in the world." The metaphor was so apt that Emily laughed out loud in the quiet parking lot. Tommy had always been insightful in ways that went unnoticed by their more dramatic classmates, and apparently that quality had only sharpened with age. "I should probably head back in," Emily said, reluctantly. "Sarah's going to wonder where I disappeared to." "Before you do," Tommy said, reaching into his back pocket for his phone, "can I give you my number? I'd love to stay in touch. Maybe next time you're in San Francisco, we could grab coffee, compare notes on stubborn dreaming." They exchanged contact information, and Emily felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the knot she'd been carrying since walking into the gymnasium. Tommy's presence had reminded her of something she'd forgotten. She hadn't been the only one watching and hoping and planning escape. Other dreamers had made it out, had built lives that honored their teenage ambitions rather than abandoning them.
"Thank you," she said as they prepared to part ways, "for remembering, for sharing that with me. I didn't realize how much I needed to hear it." Thank you for being brave enough to dream out loud, Tommy replied. Some of us were listening, even when it didn't seem like it. As Emily walked back toward the gymnasium doors, she felt different than she had an hour earlier. The weight of judgment still pressed down on her, but now it was balanced by something else. The knowledge that her teenage courage had mattered to someone had served as proof that escape was possible. She was ready to face Mark Dawson again. The gymnasium felt less oppressive when Emily re-entered, though the decorations remained the same and the crowd continued their nostalgic performances. Something in her posture had shifted during her conversation with Tommy. Her shoulders sat straighter, her chin lifted with the kind of quiet confidence that came from remembering who she was before the world told her who she should be. Sarah spotted her immediately, relief flooding her features as Emily made her way back to their table. "There you are! I was about to send out a search party. Everything okay?" "Better than okay," Emily replied, settling into her chair with a small smile that carried hints of the fire Tommy had helped rekindle. Just needed some air and perspective. The slideshow had ended while she was outside, replaced by a DJ playing a carefully curated playlist of early 2000s hits that sent waves of recognition and nostalgia through the crowd. Groups had formed and reformed around the gymnasium, people gravitating toward familiar social clusters or striking up conversations with classmates they'd barely spoken to during high school. Emily was scanning the room, cataloging faces and trying to remember names when she spotted a figure that made her heart skip. Coach Reynolds stood near the refreshment table, his silver hair carefully combed and his posture as straight as it had been 2 decades earlier. He wore the same style of clothes he'd always favored, khakis, a button-down shirt, and a tie that suggested formality without pretension. Robert Reynolds had been Emily's debate coach, but more than that, he'd been one of the few adults in her teenage life who'd treated her ambitions as reasonable rather than ridiculous. While other teachers had offered well-meaning advice about realistic expectations and practical backup plans, Coach Reynolds had pushed her to articulate bigger visions, to defend bolder arguments, to never settle for the safe position when the challenging one might be right. Emily excused herself from Sarah and made her way across the gymnasium, weaving between clusters of conversation and avoiding eye contact with Mark Dawson's table. Coach Reynolds was examining the dessert selection with the careful attention he'd once brought to evaluating tournament brackets, his expression serious as he considered the merits of various cookie options. "Coach Reynolds?" He turned and his face transformed with the kind of genuine delight that couldn't be faked. "Emily Carter, I was hoping you'd be here tonight." His voice carried the same warm authority she remembered from countless after-school practice sessions, the tone of someone who believed deeply in the potential of young minds. They embraced briefly, and Emily was struck by how much smaller she seemed than her teenage memories suggested. Coach Reynolds had loomed large in her high school world, a figure of intellectual authority and unwavering support. Now she realized he was barely taller than she was, his presence magnified by character rather than physical stature. "You look wonderful," he said, stepping back to study her face with the careful attention he'd once brought to evaluating arguments. "Successful, content, like someone who's found her place in the world." The observation was so perfectly Coach Reynolds, specific, thoughtful, designed to look beneath surface appearances to deeper truths. Emily felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, remembering how desperately she had craved this kind of recognition during her teenage years. "Thank you," she said simply. "How are you? Are you still teaching?" "Retired 5 years ago. 43 years in the classroom, and I finally decided it was time to let someone else shape young minds. Though I still substitute occasionally. Hard habit to break, you know?" Emily could imagine him in retirement, probably reading voraciously, maybe traveling to historical sites, definitely staying engaged with current events and educational theory. Coach Reynolds had been the kind of teacher who brought his subject to life through sheer force of enthusiasm, who made debate feel like a form of intellectual combat that could change the world. "I still remember your senior year presentation," Coach Reynolds said, his eyes taking on the distant look of someone accessing a treasured memory. The one about global entrepreneurship and sustainable development. You argued that business could be a force for social good, that profit and purpose didn't have to be mutually exclusive. Most of the class thought you were being idealistic, Coach Reynolds continued, his voice taking on the warm tone of someone sharing a confidence. A few snickered when you talked about building a business that could impact supply chains across multiple continents. But I remember thinking, this girl sees possibilities the rest of us haven't even imagined yet. The memory surfaced gradually, carrying with it the particular vulnerability of teenage conviction. She could see the classroom, remember the way certain classmates had exchanged glances when she'd outlined her vision for ethical manufacturing, recall the heat in her cheeks when someone had whispered, "Pipe dream," just loud enough to be heard. I remember Mark Dawson asking you how you planned to compete with companies that didn't worry about workers' rights or environmental impact, Coach Reynolds continued, his expression growing slightly stern. And you said something that I've quoted to students ever since. Emily shook her head slightly, the specific words lost to time and the accumulated weight of 2 decades of experience. You said, "We'll compete by building something so much better that people won't be able to ignore the difference. Ethics isn't just about doing right, it's about doing better." Coach Reynolds' voice carried the cadence of someone who'd repeated these words many times, who'd found in them a teaching tool worth preserving. I knew then that you'd find a way to make it work. The words hit Emily with the force of recognition and validation she hadn't known she needed. Her 17-year-old self had been more prophetic than she'd realized, articulating principles that would become the foundation of Aurora Thread's business model. The naive idealism that Mark and others had mocked had actually been sophisticated thinking disguised as youthful enthusiasm. "Did I really say that?" Emily asked softly. "Word for word. I wrote it down that night because I knew it was something special." Coach Reynolds studied her face with the intensity of someone reading between the lines. "I take it the business world treated you well? You found a way to build that company you dreamed about?" The question was gentle but direct, the kind of inquiry that invited honesty rather than performance. Emily found herself wanting to tell Coach Reynolds everything about Aurora Threads, about the brutal early years, about the victories and setbacks that had shaped her journey from idealistic teenager to seasoned CEO. "I did," she said simply. "It took longer than I expected, and the path wasn't anything like what I imagined at 17. But yes, I built something that matters." Coach Reynolds' smile widened, carrying the particular pride of a teacher whose student had exceeded even optimistic expectations. "I'm not surprised. You had that rare combination of vision and stubbornness that successful entrepreneurs need. Plus, you were never afraid of being wrong, which meant you were never afraid of learning." The observation was so accurate that Emily laughed out loud. She had forgotten how well Coach Reynolds had known her, how he had been able to see past her teenage insecurities to identify the strengths she hadn't recognized in herself. "You always believed you would find a way," he continued, his voice taking on the warm authority that had made him such an effective teacher. "Not just because you were smart. Plenty of students were smart. But because you were willing to be uncomfortable in service of something larger than yourself. That's rare at any age, but especially at 17. Emily felt tears threatened again, overwhelmed by the recognition from someone whose opinion had mattered so deeply during her formative years. Coach Reynolds represented the road not taken, the voice of encouragement rather than discouragement, the adult who'd seen potential rather than presumption in her teenage ambitions. "Thank you," she managed, "for believing in me when others didn't, for seeing possibilities I couldn't even articulate properly." "That's what teachers do," Coach Reynolds said gently. "We plant seeds and hope they find the right soil to grow. Sometimes we get to see the harvest, which is always a gift.
He paused, his expression becoming more serious. I hope you know that your success validates every student who's ever been told their dreams are too big. You're proof that vision matters more than permission. The comment crystallized something Emily had been feeling since her conversation with Tommy, the recognition that her journey hadn't just been about personal achievement, but about expanding the realm of what seemed possible for kids from places like Millfield. Her success was evidence that small-town backgrounds didn't have to mean small-town limitations. I should let you get back to your evening. Coach Reynolds glanced toward the crowd of reunion goers. But before I do, I want you to know how proud I am, not just of what you've accomplished, but of how you've carried yourself along the way. Success without character is just noise, but you've managed both. The praise was overwhelming in its specificity and thoughtfulness. Emily hugged him again, this time holding on longer, trying to convey through the embrace what words couldn't adequately express. As Coach Reynolds disappeared back into the crowd, Emily stood alone near the refreshment table, processing the gift he'd just given her. His words had reminded her of something she had forgotten in the daily grind of building a business empire. Her teenage self had been brave, not naive, visionary, not unrealistic. The dreams that others had mocked had actually been sophisticated thinking disguised as youthful enthusiasm.